From a player kicking 12 goals in his first match, to a team only scoring 1 point for an entire game, these are more AFL records that will never be broken. Beginning with John Coleman, one of the game's greatest ever full forwards. Across his very short 98 game career, Coleman somehow kicked 537 goals, averaging 5.48 majors per game. But it was in his debut match against Hawthorn in 1949 where the real magic happened. Coleman booted 12 goals, the most in any player's first game at the time, and that record unsurprisingly still stands to this day. The closest a player's come to it in recent times was Warren Ralph in 1984 with 9 goals, which would end up being his highest scoring game of his entire career. Tony Locker only had 2 in his first, while Buddy Franklin went goalless against Sydney in 2005. In round 6, 2011, the Gold Coast Suns had the single worst quarter any AFL club will probably ever have. The team only scored a single point, while Essendon, their opponents, went on to kick 15 goals for a first quarter score of 94 points to 1. The Bombers were winning every single centre clearance, banging it forward and scoring in seconds, while maintaining their insanely high accuracy. Kyle Reimers led all goal kickers on the ground, with 3 in the first, finishing the game with 8 goals. Gary Ablett Jr. produced Gold Coast's only score of the quarter, having his shot on the run touched on the line. No Suns player kicked more than 2 goals in the end, with Essendon winning 197 to 58, the highest score Gold Coast has ever conceded, for a winning margin of 139 points. It was also the Suns' biggest loss, but that record was later broken in their 150 point loss to Geelong in round 20 of that same season. The record for biggest comeback in AFL history was set in 1999, when the Hawks kicked 16 of the last 19 goals in a match against the Saints, to come back from 63 points down and secure a 13-point victory. But just 2 years later, that seemingly impossible record was broken. Essendon were a much better team than North Melbourne in 2001, having gone nearly undefeated the previous season. Somehow, the Kangaroos managed to dominate the opening quarter, scoring 12 goals to 2. The scores were 73 to 15 at the first break. 10 minutes into the second quarter, that 58-point lead was up to 69. Then, out of nowhere, everything changed. An onslaught of 10 Bombers goals in the second quarter cut the margin to 21. Eventually, in the fourth quarter, Essendon hit the lead, thanks to an amazing performance from Matthew Lloyd on the day, bagging 9 goals. Essendon won the match by 12 points, 171 to 159. Recently, in 2015, the Bulldogs were in such great form that they were outright favourites for their match against St Kilda. These odds were increased when they kicked their way to a 49-point halftime lead. Jake Stringer opened the third term scoring, and all seemed good and well for the Dogs. But out of nowhere, the Saints piled on 7 unanswered goals, cutting the margin down to just 12 points at the final break. After kicking 12 of the last 14 goals, Tom Hickey put them in front before Jack Billings kicked the sealer. It would take a miracle to beat the 69-point record. As far as I could find, no AFL team has ever gone 0-6 to start the season and come back to make the top 8 and secure a spot in the finals, except the 2017 Sydney Swans team. After making the 2016 Grand Final as favourites and losing in a shock upset, you expected the Swans to burst out of the gates in 2017, but that didn't happen. First, a shock 28-point loss to Port Adelaide, then a not so out of the ordinary 23-point loss to the Bulldogs. But when Sydney endured their 6th loss in a row against Carlton, the team with the lowest percentage in the competition, something snapped. They belted Brisbane by 54 points the next week, before going on an insane winning streak of 14 wins and only 2 losses. Both of these were 6-point losses against Hawthorn. A 65-point obliteration of Essendon in the elimination final saw them reach the semi-final against Geelong. But everything went wrong, as Patrick Dangerfield dominated up forward with 4 goals, and Buddy Franklin somehow went goalless. The 59-point loss was a heartbreaking end to the season. Imagine if they'd done the impossible and won a premiership. Carlton and Richmond were the 2 best teams going into the 1972 final series. The 2 first met in the semi-final, with it ending in a 61-all draw, before the Tigers belted the Blues by 41 in the replay. They then faced each other once again for the biggest game of the year. This match broke the record for the highest scoring grand final in AFL history. Coach Keith Mackenzie's strategy to sacrifice some defensive ability in favour of attacking was genius. He knew Richmond would score over 100 points no matter what, and so Carlton probably had to pile on 120 plus to win. Neil Baum's 5 goals made him the Tigers' leading scorer, but Kevin Bartlett's scoreless performance offset this. The Blues, on the other hand, had 2 players, John Nichols and Robert Walls, both kick 6 goals won, while Alex Jesaulenko booted 7 goals straight. In the end, accuracy was the deciding factor. 28 goals 9 to 22 goals 18. Carlton ended up winning 177 to 150, forming a combined score of 327. The closest teams to beating this record were the Hawks and the Cats in what's widely considered the greatest grand final of all time in 1989. Gary Ablett Sr. single-handedly kept Geelong in it with 9 goals won, while Jason Dunstall and Gary Buckenara shared the scoring with 4 each. Both teams kicked 21 goals, but Hawthorn had 18 behinds to Geelong's 12 to win 144 to 138. This combined score of 282 didn't even scrape past 300 points, ensuring that the 1972 record will stand for a considerable amount of time. Over 100 years ago, in 1899, second place Geelong faced bottom of the ladder St Kilda at Corio Oval. The Saints had an abysmal percentage of 28. The Cats' score of 162 was never going to be beaten by the Saints. Jim McShane became the first VFL player to ever kick 10 or more goals, with 11 majors. What was St Kilda's score? A single point. And because the league didn't record stats for behinds back then, we don't even know who saved the Saints from going scoreless. Or maybe it was a rush behind. There's no chance that this record ever gets broken. Subscribe.